August 1942. The forests of occupied Belarus around the small town of Dolginovo no longer feel quiet or safe. Between the dark trunks of pine and birch, a slow, uneven line of people moves forward. They are not soldiers and not partisans. They are civilians who have lost their homes and almost everything that made life normal. Only weeks before they lived in Dolginovo, a small town that looked like many others in this part of Europe. Narrow streets with wooden houses, a synagogue in the center, small shops where everyone knew each other by name. Most of the population was Jewish. That familiar world ended when the Germans came, created a ghetto, and began the so-called actions. Behind this cold word stood the same picture that repeated itself in dozens of towns. People driven out of their houses, shots at the edge of pits, fire that ate whole streets in a single day. Some managed to break out of this chaos and run into the forest. They escaped the bullets, but not the war. They went into the trees with almost nothing, a child in their arms, a small bundle with a few clothes, a piece of bread in a pocket. At first they were sure that the worst was already behind them. They were alive. They were not in the ghetto. They were not standing in front of a firing squad. Only later did they understand that life in the forest without food, shelter, or medicine is a very slow way of dying. The days began to look the same. People dug shallow holes in the ground to hide in. They tried to sleep under branches that did not protect them from rain or cold. Hunger did not leave them for a single hour. Children cried quietly until they stopped having the strength to cry at all. Old people sat for a long time without moving, because every movement cost too much energy. Parents counted not money or time, but the last pieces of bread and the last potatoes they could get from nearby villages. In these same forests, Soviet partisans were already operating. For the fugitives, the word partisan sounded like hope. Somewhere out there were armed men who fought the occupiers. Somewhere there might be food and protection. For the partisans, the news was much heavier. It was one thing to hide and feed a small group of fighters who could move fast and carry weapons. It was something completely different to take responsibility for hundreds of starving civilians who could barely walk, and who included many children and sick people. Among the men in one of these partisan units was a former Red Army officer named Nikolai Kiselev. He had already seen how the front could collapse in a matter of days. He had been taken prisoner and had managed to escape. Now he served in the forest as a commander who knew how to give clear orders and take responsibility. He still did not know that very soon his commanders would turn to him with a task that sounded less like a normal military mission and more like an impossible gamble. Take these people, lead them through enemy territory, bring them alive to the Soviet side. Bring as many as you can. Long before the forest of Dolginovo, Nikolai Kiselev learned what it meant to live with little and work hard. He was born in a poor rural family, where extra words had no value and promises had weight. From childhood, he knew that if you say you will do something, you do it, even if it hurts and even if no one is watching. There was no romance in this, just habit and necessity. As a young man, he went into the army. For many, it was just service, a fixed period before returning home. For him, it became a school that shaped him. The army taught him how to read maps, how to command a squad, how to keep calm when others began to panic. It also taught him something less obvious. People are fragile, and at the same time they can do more than they believe, if someone shows them how. He was not a famous commander, not a man whose name stood in newspapers. He was one of thousands of officers who quietly did their work. He followed regulations, he prepared exercises, he led marches. Those around him later remembered not loud speeches, but a certain steadiness. He did not raise his voice often. When he did, people listened. When he gave an order, he was ready to carry the same weight as his men. Before the war, he probably did not imagine that these skills would one day decide the fate of hundreds of civilians. For him, like for many, the army was a profession and a way to serve his country in a structured, understandable world. There were rules, ranks, Clear lines on the map, clear definitions of success and failure. All of that began to crumble in June 1941 when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. The front moved fast. Whole units disappeared. Plans written in neat handwriting lost their meaning in a matter of days. For some officers, this chaos became a reason to break inside. For Kiselev, it became a test of whether the simple, strict rules he grew up with would survive contact with disaster. The first months of war did not look like the careful diagrams drawn in pre-war classrooms. The front did not bend in a smooth arc. It fell apart in pieces. Columns of refugees mixed with retreating soldiers. Roads clogged with carts, trucks, scattered equipment. Reports arrived late or did not arrive at all. Orders changed faster than they could be carried out. Kiselev served as an officer in a unit that, like many others, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that moved faster and hit harder than anyone had expected. Positions prepared in advance were bypassed. Communications were cut. One day, his men still had a clear line of supply and a rifle behind every pair of hands. A short time later, they were already short of ammunition and almost surrounded. The moment of collapse rarely looks heroic from the inside. It is confusion, dust, and the bitter realization that the situation is no longer under control. Kiselev tried to do what he had been trained to do: keep his people together, organize a retreat, find a new defensive line. For a time, it worked. Then the circle tightened. German units closed the ring. Somewhere far away, other formations were also surrounded. Individual pockets of resistance began to look like islands in a rising flood. At some point, the choice became brutally simple: die on the spot in a hopeless fight, or try to break out through a wall of enemy fire. The attempt failed. Many of his comrades were killed in the chaos. Those who survived were captured. Among them was Kiselev. German prisoner of war camps in 1941 were places with almost no future. Hunger, disease, overcrowding, violence, and a cold, indifferent system that did not plan to keep Soviet prisoners alive for long. For an officer, the risks were even higher. Escape attempts were punished without mercy. Still, for Kiselev, staying in the camp meant waiting passively for the end, and that went against every rule by which he had lived. Planning an escape required patience and silence. He observed the routines: when the guards changed, where the fences were weakest, how other prisoners moved. He watched who among his fellow captives still had enough strength left in body and mind to try. An escape is not only a hole in the wire, it is also a decision shared by several people to risk everything together. The exact details of his escape are known only in fragments, but the result is clear. One day, Kiselev was no longer in the camp. He crossed fields by night, hid in ditches and abandoned buildings, drank from muddy streams, avoided roads where military vehicles passed. Hunger followed him again, this time together with the constant fear of being recognized or betrayed. Eventually, he reached forested areas where rumor spoke of Soviet partisans. At first, contact was dangerous for both sides. The partisans did not trust strangers who appeared from nowhere. The escaped officer had to prove who he was and what he could do. When they finally accepted him into a partisan unit, he returned to a familiar role: a commander among armed men, responsible not only for his own survival, but for the lives of those around him. He took part in ambushes on German columns, raids on police posts, sabotage on roads and rail lines. It was a different kind of war, fought in shadows and swamps instead of trenches and open fields. Yet the same qualities were required: discipline, endurance, and the ability to make decisions when there was no good choice, only less terrible ones. These were the qualities that would soon be tested in a way he could not yet imagine. Life in the partisan unit followed a harsh rhythm. Days were spent hidden deep in the forest, repairing weapons, drying clothes over small smokeless fires, sending out scouts. Nights were for movement and raids. A small group would creep toward a road, lay explosives, wait in the dark for the sound of an engine, then disappear before the enemy could react. It was a war of patience and sudden violence. Kiselev quickly became one of the people others relied on when things grew complicated. He understood maps and terrain. He could explain a plan in a few clear sentences. He did not promise what he could not deliver. In an environment where death could come from a single careless word or sound, this kind of reliability mattered more than rank. The partisans knew the nearby villages and farms. They knew which peasants helped them with food and information, and which cooperated with the Germans. From time to time, frightened locals would bring news of new German orders, planned searches, or rumors that circulated among the occupation authorities. It was from such fragments that the first pieces of a different story reached the unit. At first, the messages sounded unclear. Somewhere in the forest there were Jews who had escaped from Dolginovo. Then the number grew. Not a handful, not a single family, but dozens. Then hundreds. People spoke of children wrapped in rags, of old men unable to stand, of women who begged for any crust of bread. They were hiding in pits and makeshift shelters, moving a little and very slowly, unable to go far, and with nowhere to go. For the partisans, this news was disturbing. Their own supplies were limited. Every bullet and every loaf of bread already had to be counted. They could not simply take hundreds of civilians into their camp. A partisan unit needed mobility. A huge group of unarmed, starving people was the opposite of that. It was like suddenly being tied to a heavy weight in the middle of a river. Still, the commanders understood that turning away completely was not an option. These people were targets. The German authorities considered escaped Jews as enemies to be hunted and destroyed. Sooner or later, police units and special teams would comb the forests. And when they found the refugees, there would be no mercy. More detailed reports began to arrive. Scouts confirmed that near Dolginovo and in nearby forest belts, whole clusters of fugitives were living in conditions that could not last. They were already dying from hunger and disease. They had no weapons, no organized leadership, and no idea what to do beyond surviving one more day. Some small groups had made contact with partisans, asking for food and protection. In their eyes, the men with rifles looked like the only remaining authority in a world that had lost all structure. In meetings held under the trees, with guarded fires and maps spread on stumps, the partisan commanders discussed the situation. They could send some food when possible. They could warn the fugitives about upcoming German sweeps. But that would only postpone the inevitable. The forests could not hide hundreds of people for long, not under constant pressure from occupation forces. It was during one of these discussions that another idea appeared, at first almost as a desperate thought. What if they did not try to hide the refugees in the forest at all? What if they tried to move them, not by a few kilometers, but all the way across the territory controlled by the enemy, toward the lines of the Red Army? It sounded like madness. It also sounded like the only real chance those people had. Someone had to lead such a column. Someone who understood military organization, but could also take responsibility for civilians who were not trained, not armed, and barely able to walk. In the small clearing where the commanders talked quietly, one name soon came up more than once. The name of the former frontline officer who had already escaped death several times and who did not confuse courage with loud words. Nikolai Kiselev. At first, the proposal was met with silence. Move hundreds of starving civilians through enemy territory on foot, across rivers, roads, patrol lines and search zones, and somehow bring them to the Soviet side alive. It did not sound like a plan. It sounded like a story from a different world, one where danger and exhaustion could be turned off by closing a book. The commanders listed the obvious arguments against it. A large group would move slowly. It would leave tracks everywhere. Children could cry at the worst possible moment. Old people might collapse on the march. The Germans and their auxiliaries were already nervous about partisan activity and sent patrols deep into the forest. One informant, one chance encounter on a road, and the whole column could be wiped out. But the arguments against doing nothing were even harder to ignore. If the refugees stayed where they were, they would die anyway, from hunger, from disease, from bullets when the next sweep came. Helping them a little with small deliveries of food only stretched out the time of waiting for the same end. The partisans were fighting a war for the future. What did that future mean if they turned away from hundreds of people asking for help a few kilometers away? Gradually, the discussion shifted from whether to how. If they tried, they would need strict discipline. They would need scouts ahead and guards on the flanks. They would need to move mostly at night and rest hidden by day. They would need someone at the front of the column whom people could trust enough to obey, even when the path led into darkness and deeper exhaustion. When the time came to choose that person, the list was short. It had to be someone with experience in command, with a calm head under pressure, and with enough authority that both partisans and civilians would follow him without constant debate. The name that kept returning was Kiselev. He did not ask for this assignment. It came to him like any other order, direct, simple in form, heavy in content. The commanders explained the situation without exaggeration. Around 270 people, mostly women, children, and elderly. No weapons, almost no strength left. The task was to gather them into a single group and lead them through forests, swamps, and enemy rear areas to where the Red Army still held the ground. They did not try to hide the dangers. The column could be attacked. People could die on the way. There was no guarantee of success. When they finished, there was a short pause. Kiselev listened, weighed the words, and agreed. For him, it was not a heroic speech moment. It was an acceptance of responsibility. If this must be done, someone has to do it, now that someone was him. The first step was not movement, but gathering. The refugees from Dolginovo were scattered across the forest in small clusters. Some hid in shallow dugouts, others in abandoned sheds or under fallen trees. Messengers went out from the partisan unit to call them together. They moved carefully from one hiding place to another, repeating the same message. A group would try to lead them out, far beyond the reach of the German patrols. It would be dangerous, but staying was more dangerous still. At first, many did not believe it. The idea of a long march through enemy territory sounded unreal to people who could hardly stand. Some were afraid it was a trick. Others were simply too exhausted to imagine anything beyond the next day. But the rumor spread, and slowly people began to appear at the agreed meeting place in the forest. Whole families, widows with children, old couples leaning on sticks, teenagers carrying younger siblings. When they finally came together, the scale of the task became brutally clear. Around 270 people. Most of them had the hollow look of long hunger. Clothes hung loosely on thin bodies. Many feet were wrapped in rags instead of shoes. Some children were too weak to walk on their own. The forest clearing where they gathered looked less like the beginning of a journey and more like the end of one. Kiselev understood that without strict order, this group would simply fall apart. He spoke to them calmly and directly. He explained that the road would be long, that there would be no easy days, that danger would follow them at every step. He did not promise that everyone would reach the end. What he did promise was that he and the small armed group with him would do everything possible to protect them, but only if they accepted discipline. He then laid down the rules. The column would move mostly at night or in the early hours of dawn and dusk. During the day, they would hide in the thickest parts of the forest, in ravines or among bushes, where they could not be seen from the roads or from the air. No fires unless absolutely necessary. No loud voices, no crying out. Parents had to keep their children quiet. If German patrols were nearby, silence meant life. He organized the people into smaller groups, each with a responsible adult as a kind of squad leader. At the very front would go scouts from the partisan unit, checking the path and watching for danger. Behind them would walk Kiselev. Then the main body of the refugees. At the rear, a few armed men would make sure no one was left behind by mistake. They also decided what could be taken along. Heavy trunks and big bundles were out of the question. Every extra kilogram meant slower movement and more noise. People were told to take only what they could carry while walking for many hours, some clothing, a blanket if they had one, and whatever food they still possessed. For many, this meant leaving behind the last physical remains of their previous lives. Family objects, books, photographs. The act of choosing hurt. Some wept silently as they put aside things they had saved through fire and flight, only to abandon them now on the forest floor. But the rules were clear. Sentimentality would kill them faster than bullets. Kiselev did not shout. He just repeated, in the same steady voice, that the only real valuables now were water, food, and the strength left in their legs. When everything was finally arranged, the scouting group, the order of march, the rear guard, the minimal loads, the clearing grew unusually still. The people stood in a long, loose line between the trees, waiting. It was not a parade. It was a column of the weak, led by a handful of armed men, about to step into a path that none of them could fully imagine. Kiselev looked along the line, nodded once, and gave the first simple command of the journey. Move. The first nights on the march quickly erased any illusions that this would be a simple movement from one point on a map to another. The forest that had seemed static when they hid in it now turned into a moving labyrinth. Roots caught at tired feet. Low branches scratched faces in the dark. Every snapped twig sounded louder than it really was. The line stretched and compressed like a breathing thing as people struggled to keep pace. Kiselev and the scouts chose paths that avoided roads and villages. When they had to cross an open space, the column bunched up, moved as quickly as possible, and disappeared into cover again. The pace was slow, measured not in kilometers, but in how many people could still walk without collapsing. From time to time, they stopped for short breaks, just long enough for the weakest to catch their breath. Then came the same quiet word from the front, and the line began to move again. Hunger marched with them. The small supplies of food people had brought were gone within days. A piece of bread was broken into tiny parts so that children could receive something in their hands. The partisans shared what they had, knowing that their own strength would also depend on these same rations later. Sometimes local peasants, at great personal risk, gave potatoes or a little flour. Sometimes there was nothing to be had, and the column simply moved on with empty stomachs. Fear was always present, but it had layers. There was fear of German patrols and police units. But there was also fear of being left behind, of not being able to walk any farther, of becoming a burden to those who still had strength. In the rear of the column, the armed men watched not only for danger from outside, but also for signs that someone was silently stepping away into the darkness to lie down and not rise again. Yet alongside hunger and fear, there was something else that refused to disappear. A thin, stubborn thread of hope. Each step meant one step farther from Dolginovo and the pits outside town. Each night of movement that did not end in shots or shouting felt like a small, fragile victory. Kiselev did not encourage fantasies about an easy end. He spoke instead of the next day, the next stretch of forest, the next river. In this way, the impossible distance ahead was broken into pieces small enough for people to face without losing their will to continue. The danger around them did not remain abstract for long. Signs of the enemy were everywhere, even when no uniforms were visible. Fresh tracks of boots on forest paths, cigarette butts near a clearing, broken branches at the edge of a field where no refugees had passed. All of it meant that German soldiers and police units were also moving through these woods, searching for partisans and the people who helped them. Scouts brought back fragments of conversation overheard near villages. The authorities knew that Jews from Dolginovo had escaped. Orders had gone out to find them. Patrols were sent along roads and into the forest, sometimes with dogs. Occasionally, the column would be forced to stop in the middle of the night because the scouts had seen light from lanterns swinging between the trees or heard the clatter of weapons. Then people stood silently, hardly daring to breathe, until the danger passed. Human beings were a threat too. Not everyone in the occupied countryside was willing to risk their life to help fugitives. Some feared German punishment more than they pitied starving strangers. Others cooperated actively with the occupiers, hoping for rewards or simply trying to secure their own survival. Kiselev knew that one careless visit to the wrong house, one conversation overheard in the wrong yard, could bring a patrol straight onto their trail. To reduce that risk, he limited contact with the outside world. Only a few trusted men approached villages, usually at night, to beg or barter for food and information. They asked questions without revealing more than necessary. Had there been searches in the area? Were there any new units stationed nearby? Had anyone spoken about Jews hiding in the forest? Every scrap of news was weighed carefully before being shared with the column. Sometimes they learned that German forces were preparing a sweep of a particular sector. On those days, the route had to be changed quickly. The column turned away from relative safety and went into unfamiliar territory, accepting short-term hardship to avoid sudden destruction. There were moments when they marched for hours longer than planned, just to be sure they were not moving toward an invisible trap. In this constant tension, even normal sounds of the forest could be misleading. A cracking branch might be a wild animal or a boot. A distant shout might be a farmer calling his cow, or a soldier calling his comrades. The only way to live with that uncertainty was discipline. People learned to freeze at a single gesture from the scouts, to sink silently to the ground when Kiselev raised his hand, to hold a child's mouth gently but firmly when nerves threatened to break. The enemy did not see them, not yet, but everyone understood that this was not luck in the simple sense. It was the result of hundreds of small, controlled actions. Where to step, when to move, whom to trust, when to turn away. In a landscape saturated with danger, survival depended on these invisible choices as much as on the rifles carried by the few armed men at the head and tail of the line. The hardest days did not announce themselves with any special sign. There was no single battle or storm that marked a clear turning point. It was simply that exhaustion, which had been walking beside them from the start, finally tried to move ahead and take the lead. People began to fall more often. At first, they stumbled and recovered. Later, they stayed on the ground longer after each stop, struggling to stand when the column moved again. Legs swelled. Old wounds reopened. Coughs that had sounded light turned into deep, tearing ones. Fever appeared without warning. There were no doctors, only basic knowledge and a few remaining bandages. Children who had surprised even their own parents with their ability to walk now sometimes just stared in silence, eyes too large on thin faces. Older siblings or adults carried them on their backs until their own strength ran out. Every extra kilogram of weight felt like a stone, yet few could bring themselves to put a child down and admit they could no longer lift them. Death was no longer something distant that existed somewhere behind the front lines or only in Dolginovo. It walked among them. One morning, a person who had gone to sleep whispering a tired joke did not wake up. Another simply sat down during a break and could not be persuaded to rise. The column could not stop for long. Burials were quick, marked only by a shallow grave and a whispered farewell. Then they moved on, carrying the weight of absence along with their bundles. In such moments, the temptation to give up grew strong. Quiet questions began to circulate. Was this journey really leading anywhere? Were they truly getting closer to Soviet lines, or were they simply circling through endless trees until the last of them fell? Kiselev understood that rifles alone could not hold the group together now. What mattered was trust. He walked not far from the front, where people could see him. He answered questions honestly. When someone asked, "Are we close?" he did not invent comforting lies, but he always pointed to concrete progress. A river they had crossed, a road they had left behind, a region he knew they had passed. He also made decisions that were painful but necessary. Sometimes he ordered a longer rest when the scouts reported no immediate danger, even though it meant losing time. Sometimes he forced the column to move when everyone wanted to stop, because staying in that place would have meant walking into a trap the next day. His authority was not based on speeches. It was built step by step, on the visible fact that under his leadership they were still alive. The signs that they were nearing the front did not come all at once. First it was distant thunder that was not thunder at all, but artillery. At night, the horizon sometimes flickered with a dull, reddish glow. The scouts reported more tracks of heavy vehicles and fresher traces of soldiers moving in organized groups. The war, which had surrounded them like a fog, was now concentrated in a line somewhere ahead. For the refugees, the idea of getting closer to the front felt both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because beyond that line, they believed, were Soviet units, real hospitals, real food, some form of order. Terrifying because the front was where shells fell and bullets did not ask who was a soldier and who was a child. Kiselev understood that the last stretch would be the most dangerous. German defences were denser here. Patrols were more frequent. Mines and wire obstacles could be hidden in fields and along forest edges. He relied heavily on his scouts, sending them far ahead to find a place where civilians could approach without walking directly into a firefight or an artillery barrage. There came a day when the scouts returned with different news. They had seen not German helmets, but shapes and equipment that belonged to the Red Army. A forward position, cautiously dug into the edge of a wood. Men in familiar uniforms who watched the trees with suspicion, expecting enemy infiltrators or saboteurs. Reaching that line still required careful movement. The column stopped while Kiselev and a small group of his partisans went forward under cover, waving pieces of cloth and shouting in Russian that they were their own. The soldiers on the other side reacted the way frontline troops must react, with readiness to fire if anything seemed wrong. Voices overlapped. Questions were shouted across the distance. Who are you? From where? What unit? Kiselev answered with details only a real Soviet officer would know. Names of formations, places of previous service, codes and facts that could be checked. At last, someone on the Soviet side made a decision. A few soldiers came out carefully to meet them, weapons still ready. After a tense exchange, they lowered their guns. Word was sent back to the main line. It was not a German trick. It was an officer with a partisan group, and with him, hundreds of civilians who had somehow crossed the depth of the occupied zone on foot. Only then did Kiselev signal the column to move. One by one, in small groups, the refugees stepped out of the forest toward the Soviet positions. Some walked stiffly, as if afraid the ground would vanish under their feet. Others simply stared, struggling to understand that there were finely armed men around them who were not there to kill them. For many, the first sight of a Red Army star on a cap felt unreal, like an image from a life that belonged to someone else. The soldiers who received them were not prepared for such a crowd. They shared what little they had: bread, hot water, pieces of sugar. Medical personnel examined the weakest. Names and basic details were written down in notebooks. The war did not stop for them. Shells still fell somewhere nearby. Orders still moved along the front. But for the people from Dolginovo, crossing that invisible line between enemy and friendly territory marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another, quieter but no less uncertain one. When the column finally stood behind Soviet lines, the war did not suddenly release its grip on them. They were safe from German patrols and mass shootings, but not from hunger, disease, or the long work of rebuilding lives that had been broken more than once. The people from Dolginovo were moved farther into the rear, to towns and villages that still functioned, to improvised camps, hospitals, and temporary housing. For the first time in many months, they had roofs over their heads that were not made of branches. They slept on real beds, or at least on straw inside solid walls. They received regular food, whatever the front could spare. Doctors examined the children and the elderly, treating infections that had been ignored on the march and chronic conditions that had worsened in the forest. Some illnesses could be cured. Others had gone too far. Even in safety, death did not vanish completely. Families that had survived together tried to understand what together still meant after everything they had seen. Those who had lost relatives searched for news, asking about people who had not appeared at the final roll call. In many cases, there was no answer to give. The last time anyone had seen them was on a forest path, at a roadside ditch, or outside the burning ghetto in Dolginovo. Silence in those cases spoke louder than words. Some of the rescued later moved east, deeper into the Soviet rear, where factories had been evacuated and new communities were forming. After the war, many would scatter further across the world, to large Soviet cities, and later, for some, to Israel, America, or other countries. Yet no matter how far their roads led, the memory of the march under Kiselev's command stayed with them. In testimonies and interviews decades later, they still described not only the hunger and fear, but also the calm figure who walked near the front of the column, who rarely raised his voice, and who never abandoned them when the path was hardest. For Kiselev, the end of the march did not mean the end of his service. He returned to a more familiar kind of work, military and state duties in a country that was still fighting for its survival. After the war, he did not turn himself into a public hero. He did not tour schools or demand recognition. He lived a largely quiet life, working in official positions, raising a family, carrying his memories mostly in silence. Those around him knew that he had been a partisan and that he had done something important. But the full scale of what he had accomplished was not widely discussed. In a nation where millions had died and countless acts of bravery had occurred, his story became one thread among many, present but not loudly displayed. He accepted this without complaint. In his understanding, he had simply done what duty required. He had been given people to lead, and he had led them as far as his strength and the circumstances allowed. Recognition came slowly, almost cautiously, and mostly after Kiselev himself was gone. For many years, his march from Dolginovo lived mainly in the memories of those he had saved. They told their children and grandchildren about the forest, the hunger, the nights of silent movement, and the officer who had refused to abandon them. These were family stories, passed on at kitchen tables or in letters, not in official histories. Only later, when researchers began to collect testimonies about the Holocaust in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, did the scale of what had happened become clearer to the outside world. Archivists, historians, and journalists pieced together documents from partisan reports, military records, and survivor accounts. The numbers emerged: around 270 people at the start, 218 brought alive through enemy territory to the Soviet side. No vehicles, no prepared shelters, just a line of civilians on foot, protected by a handful of armed men and led by one officer who refused to treat the task as impossible. In Israel, at the Yad Vashem Memorial, these details had special weight. The institution existed to remember not only those who had been murdered, but also those few non-Jews who had risked their own lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. For that, they used a precise term: righteous among the nations. It was not given lightly. It required evidence, cross-checked stories, and clear proof that help had been given at great personal risk without expectation of reward. When the story of the Dolginovo March was examined under this standard, Kiselev's actions met every part of the definition. He had taken responsibility for hundreds of Jews in a region where being associated with them meant immediate danger. He had not acted once, on a single night, but over weeks and months, facing constant risk from enemy forces and from the simple possibility of failure. He had done so as a commanding officer, fully aware that if the column were caught, he would be among the first to die. Posthumously, he was recognized as righteous among the nations. His name was inscribed alongside others who had hidden families in attics, forged documents, or smuggled children out of ghettos. Trees were planted, plaques were placed, and in ceremonies far from the forests of Belarus, survivors and their descendants spoke his name aloud as someone who had given them not an abstraction, but a very concrete gift: the years of life that followed that march. Today, his story stands out even against the vast background of wartime heroism. Many helped individuals or small groups. Very few led hundreds of civilians on foot through deep enemy rear to safety. Kiselev did not invent a new tactic or win a famous battle. Instead, he treated a column of starving refugees as if they were his unit, his responsibility, and his purpose. The meaning of his act is not only in the number of lives saved, though that number is significant. It is also in the way he bridged two worlds: the disciplined, pragmatic world of a military officer and the desperate, fragile world of civilians who had lost everything. He did not ask them to become soldiers. He used his knowledge so that they could remain what they were allowed to be once they reached safety: mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, ordinary people with a future. For those who hear his story now, far from Dolginovo and long after the war, it offers a simple but demanding lesson. In times when survival seems to excuse any compromise, there still exist choices that place the lives of others at the center. One man in a forest, with a small group of comrades and a column of exhausted people behind him, chose that path and walked it all the way to the end.